So this presentation is focused on the health of those in the workplace, also known as occupational health. By the end of this chapter, I hope that you can describe various events in the history of occupational health, what the role of occupational health has played for environmental health, identify physical and psychological effects of occupational hazards, describe 5 categories of health impacts of occupational hazards, and list methods for preventing occupational-related diseases. Occupational medicine is a field of medicine that's focused on detecting and preventing diseases that arise from the work environment. And interestingly enough, much of the early environmental occupational work was done by physicians. As you've learned, John Snow was a physician, and many other physicians were being trained on their own to understand why certain people had different types of diseases. Occupational disease is defined as those health outcomes that are caused or influenced by exposure to general conditions or hazards specific to the workplace. The origin of occupational health has roots thousands of years ago, where miners, people that were mining ore, had occupational risks, and this was back in Greek and Roman times. They noticed that people that were using the bellows, which is how they heated the material to get the ore out of it, had certain exposures and certain health outcomes that no one else had. Important in the history of occupational health were 3 key figures. One that raises who used occupational classifications in medical case descriptions. So what's important about this is that people start asking you, what is your job, when they're looking at you and trying to diagnose diseases. Of course, Paracelsus, who we often attribute toxicology to, wrote a book on occupational diseases. And in the next slide, I'll talk about this last figure, who is Bernardino Ramazzini. Considered the father of occupational medicine, he wrote a book that described different types of diseases of workers, and it highlighted hazardous chemicals, dusts, and metals used in the workplace. Historically, there are a lot of different examples of people that became ill, groups of people that all did a specific type of job. Miners are often described as having breathing problems like asthma. Potters that would often have certain types of diseases that are associated with making pottery. Mad Hatter's disease, if you've ever heard the story of the Mad Hatter or Alice in Wonderland, those people that made hats worked with mercury in the hats and it made them go crazy. Phossy jaw is a jaw associated with being exposed to certain radioactive chemicals and different types of cancers. One of the good examples is chimney sweeps were identified as having high risk for cancer of the scrotum or scrotal cancer, and this has to do with how they were being exposed to the soot and where. We'll describe a couple of accidents in the workplace that are historical and help shift how we assessed and protected workers. The first is a fire. This is a company that was making shirts. It happened in New York City. Again, in the garment industry, this was a time period where women were being employed. They were perhaps not being cared for well. And in this particular setting, the doors of this building were locked and the fire escapes were non-functional. So when the fire happened, so many people died. And you still see these events today. There's been probably not in the far past an event where there was a fire at a factory. This factory happened to be in another country, and many workers died either because there wasn't adequate fire protection, the fire escapes weren't working, or sometimes the doors were locked. The Gauley Bridge disaster is not only a good example of a huge problem in occupational health, but one of the beginnings of the things that I like to talk about when we think about environmental justice. This was a bridge that was being built. It had to require that workers dig in high levels of silica, which is a certain type of mineral that's almost like sand. And when you use drills and other types of devices to dig through rock that has silica, it puts a lot of dust. And that dust causes almost like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. It causes a disease of the lungs called silicosis that is progressive, meaning once you've been exposed to it, your breathing gets worse and worse, even after exposure has stopped. Immediately resulted in 1,000 deaths for everyone that worked on this tunnel disaster case, and about 1,500 cases of silicosis, but likely to be many more. We have systems in place that do surveillance of injuries and illnesses in the workplace, both fatal and non-fatal. And in 2002, there were 4.7 million newly reported cases of non-fatal injuries and illnesses in the workplace. This number has declined to, in 2008, 3.7 million. And leading causes of injuries or illnesses in the workplace were sprains and strains. That's increasing now with a lot of the work that has shifted from major heavy manufacturing to a lot of service industry work, including healthcare, hospitality, etc. The direct costs of injuries and illnesses are enormous for the economy, estimated at almost $50 billion in 2002. And then indirect costs, so costs associated with time away from work, costs lost in time to businesses, etc., over $200 billion. So it's a major factor that we need to consider. As I mentioned earlier, some of the leading causes of conditions that people result after injury or illness in the workplace include sprains and strains, cuts, punctures, bruises, and contusions. And the majority of these took place in service providing sector. And this can range from everything to healthcare, to restaurants, to hospitality like hotels, etc. What are some of the key things in the occupational environment that can cause injury? We call these the agents. Of course, noise, dusts, and these dusts are not just non-harmful. The dust itself can make people feel sick, but these dusts can often have chemicals in them that make people feel sick. If you're in larger manufacturing businesses, you may encounter heavy metals and their fumes, carbon monoxide, which if you've ever used a device that runs on gasoline, like a generator or a gas-powered lawnmower or a gas-powered leaf blower, you can be exposed to carbon monoxide fumes. As I mentioned, chemicals, radiation. If you remember the story of the radium girls from our lectures on radiation. Microbial agents, of course, in the healthcare industry, we would be very concerned about being exposed both with person-to-person contact and then accidental contact through needle punctures. Lifting heavy weights, this can happen in lots of different industries. Repetitive motion, workplace accidents, and work-related stress. So not only are we considering the physical, chemical, biologic agents, but we're also considering the psychosocial components of the workplace. Noise is anything that can produce hearing loss, very large sounds, and even some chemicals in the environment can do that. And repeated exposure to noise can be very harmful. Toxic heavy metals and their fumes, as you guys have learned, heavy metals are easily toxic at low concentrations. There's no role in the body for those elements. And they are used in a lot of different products. Arsenic, lead, mercury, cadmium, chromium, and nickel are commonly used in manufacturing of different types of products. Heavy metals that are causing people to be at risk from breathing fumes and dust that contain toxic levels of these metals. And so you get exposed to these and it has big ramifications. As I mentioned, carbon monoxide is colorless, it's odorless. The Carbon monoxide substitutes for oxygen in the body, and so it makes oxygen uptake very difficult. And anyone that has a pre-existing condition is even more susceptible to carbon monoxide exposure. Most time people will see carbon monoxide exposure when they're using equipment indoors with closed windows and they're not ventilating the area properly. Various microbes, viruses, bacteria, sometimes parasites, can put health workers at risk. They're often exposed to things via sewage. Agricultural workers may be exposed to bacteria and viruses and disease-carrying insects. And of course, perhaps the most drastic evidence of this was when Ebola was transferred to some of the medical doctors that were treating cases in the outbreak in West Africa. We actually saw that happen to nurses in a hospital in Texas as well. So there's lots of different occupational risks that healthcare workers face. As I mentioned, we're not just talking about physical, chemical, and microbiologic agents. We're also talking about psychosocial. And chronic stress has been implicated in a range of conditions, including associations with heart disease and mental disorders like depression. And many times employees react to stressful conditions by committing violent acts. And we've seen this all too often, especially, we see this workplace violence can be the result of someone losing a job or being unhappy with how they're being treated and the pressures they feel at the workplace. So I've described different agents, but they can all cause a variety of different illnesses. And here is a list of different occupationally associated diseases and conditions. People can, when they're being exposed to chemicals, can experience dermatitis, either from allergy or something else causing the skin to feel irritated. We can see a variety of respiratory diseases, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and asthma. Women can experience fertility and pregnancy abnormalities. You can understand hearing loss, infectious disease, musculoskeletal disorders like sprains and strains, and then occasionally we see traumatic injuries and fatalities. As I mentioned, there's also conditions associated with job stress like depression. Allergic and irritant dermatitis is a skin condition where you come into contact with the chemical on your skin. And this happens sometimes in manufacturing, construction, food production. These are the services that are highest at risk for skin diseases. Respiratory diseases often are chronic conditions that have long periods of time from the exposure to the development of the illness. Asbestosis is probably the one that's been most well documented in the United States, but there are lots of others, and these are often diseases where you're exposed to a chemical in the workplace, and then years later or decades later you come down with the disease. Pneumoconiosis, I mentioned silicosis, byssinosis, mesothelioma, and lung cancer are all examples of illnesses that happen decades later after the exposure. COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and asthma are a large portion of cases as a respiratory disease cases that result from exposure in the workplace. COPD can be related to exposure to dusts, and asthma has become one of the most frequently diagnosed occupational respiratory diseases in the U.S. There's things in the environment that make the asthma worse in the setting. Different types of exposures can result in fertility and pregnancy abnormalities. Chemicals in use in production have been associated with some of these, and many times these aren't intended to be at exposure to the human main population, so they aren't tested to understand these potential health effects. There are actually also some microorganisms that can cause fertility and pregnancy abnormalities as well. Hearing loss, this is probably the most common or second most commonly reported injury or illness. Many workers in the U.S. suffer from noise-induced hearing loss, and prolonged exposure can result in psychological reactions that may impact the immune system as well as physical well-being. Sound, of course, can be a wide range, and depending on the frequency and the amount of noise, it can cause different impacts. When we measure exposure to noise, we typically use what's called decibels, and this is a measure that every 1 unit represents a 10-fold increase. This is good because it allows us to characterize a large variability in range of sounds that humans can perceive. The two industries that are greatest affected by noise include the construction industry with all of the heavy equipment and the healthcare industry because of certain instruments like suctioning devices. In the workplace, NIOSH has a recommended exposure limit for an 8-hour shift of 85 decibels. This is a weighted average, which means that over that entire 8-hour period, it should average out to that 85 decibels. The workers that are at risk for infectious diseases include healthcare workers, of course, public utility workers, agricultural workers, some social service and corrections personnel, clinical laboratory specialists, mortuary workers, and people that work in the adult film industry. Musculoskeletal disorders are any disorder of the muscles, nerves, tendons, joints, cartilage, or spinal discs. And of course, this is the biggest category of injuries or disorders we see in the workplace. Sprains, strains, tears, pain, hurt, back pain, hernia, carpal tunnel, tendonitis, and then some connective disease and disorders are common in the workplace. In 2007, approximately 15 workers died every day from traumatic injuries. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported a total of 5,214 fatal injuries in 2008. So it's still a large component, and it's a traumatic loss for everyone involved. Of course, industries with the highest number of deaths include transportation and warehousing, construction, and then agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting. Job stress is any harmful physical, emotional response that occurs when the job does not match the capabilities, resources, or needs of the worker. People experience job stress all the time. Things that are mostly associated with job stress and can be conditions linked to it include anxiety, neurotic disorders. The highest categories of job stress include technical, sales, and administrative support. And they have the highest number of stress, neurotic disorders, and anxiety. And some of the challenges of those positions, which aren't often able to make their own decisions, is that they may work for someone that's demanding a lot of their time, and they don't have a lot of flexibility. And those are the sort of categories of stress that people feel most upset in. How do we prevent occupational disease? The first step is primary prevention, which is engineering controls. We make quieter machinery. We improve building ventilation. The second step would be to change the work practices, reduce the time spent on machines, implement safety and education and training programs. We can use administrative controls to rotate employees or organize work shifts. And the last step would be personal protective equipment. This is material designed to protect the employees from injury or illness as a result of contact with chemical, radiological, physical, electrical, mechanical, or other workplace hazards. The three methods of primary prevention are preferred over the use of PPE. Things that people use for PPE might be respirators to protect against airborne hazards, device to protect hearing like earmuffs or earplugs, protective eyewear, goggles, face shields, safety glasses, full face respirators. And the reason that we prefer primary prevention is that PPE requires the correct behavior for it to protect the employee. There are many systems in place that do surveillance of occupational injury and illness. And agencies that conduct this surveillance include the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, the National Center for Health Statistics, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and the Mine Safety and Health Administration. Mining is such a challenging and difficult occupation that it has its own agency. NIOSH operates the pneumoconiosis mortality surveillance system and traumatic occupational fatalities. It also has a state-based sentinel event notification system for occupational risks. The result of our knowledge about occupational illness and injury has allowed us to set limits or guidelines for exposure to hazardous agents in the workplace. These guidelines are set through OSHA, which is the Occupational Safety and Health Act, or the Health Administration. And the guidelines are often called threshold limit values, which refer to concentrations of substances that can be present and the workers won't be affected.